you can't have a reimagined prison system in isolation. We can't talk about much of what we've talked about without thinking about the role that prison plays in society and the permeability of those boundaries. And so if we want prison to be different, our institutions and our communities and society at large must also be different. So I'm joined tonight with 3 people who are deeply involved in efforts to both innovate and to create change here in Chicago and beyond. So if I could, I'll just introduce them now and then we'll jump right into conversation. So to my immediate right is Kim Fox. Kim was elected state attorney for Cook County last November with promises of transformative change. She's already becoming known as I guess I would describe it as a disrupting force and disrupting common perceptions about prosecution and the role that prosecutors play in community. Now, I've watched an episode or 2 of Law and Order, so I think I know what prosecutors do, and I think I understand you're doing something a little different. So next, to Kim's right is Julia Stash, the president of the MacArthur Foundation. Since she joined MacArthur in 2001, she's presided over some of the world's boldest and most consequential philanthropic projects, many of them rooted right here in Chicago. I've had the privilege of knowing Julie for some time, and myself a philanthropic refugee, and almost everyone in philanthropy gets introduced as producing bold ideas and creating big change and doing dramatic things. And I will say about Julia, if you know and you've watched what she's done at MacArthur for the past year and a half as its leader, that is absolutely true and a credible description of her work.
Thank you.
And finally, Arne Duncan, who's the former Secretary of Education under President Obama and is now a managing partner at the Emerson Collective, where he heads a local nonprofit called Chicago Cred. So we're going to hear a little bit more about Chicago Cred in just a second, and I'm fascinated to learn about your journey, how you've gone from running a giant school system to being Secretary of Education to doing some really fantastic micro work in the community. So thank you all for being here, and if everyone could give them a warm welcome. So this is what we're here to talk about tonight, really, is how do you create better outcomes for Chicagoans who have been impacted by incarceration, and how you can create a supportive and a healing community where there's been a great deal of harm, and how you can also reignite a sense of citizenry and hope and trust. Talked a lot about that in the context of prison, but we should talk about it in the context of community. And I guess if I could start with you, Kim, maybe with a little bit of biographical stuff. I understand that you grew up in Cabrini Green, which my recollection when I was growing up was sort of synonymous with violent crime and poverty. And so now here you are, the first elected prosecutor of color, and one of the here in this jurisdiction, and one of the very few women chief prosecutors. So if it has, I don't want to presume, but if it has, what was your experience growing up, and how is it connected to the work you're doing now?
Certainly. So I'm actually the second woman of color elected to this position. My predecessor was the first woman and the first Latina elected to this position. So to clear that, I grew up in Cabrini in the late 70s, early 80s, and Cabrini and housing projects kind of exemplify what was wrong with how we were dealing with poor people of color in this country. So you had high concentrations of poverty, literally stacked one atop of each other, and then isolated from the rest of the city. And I think the tale of how I got from Cabrini to this spot also is the tale of what exists of Cabrini right now. Where I live now, there's a Target store that was built right there, and about a block away, I drove by a few weeks ago, there's an indoor skydiving space. And when I saw it, I have to tell you that I was so angry that I lived at a time and a place where it was largely, almost exclusively African Americans at the point that my family lived there, ravaged by violence, some of the worst schools in the city, housed right in the middle of it, and just choked off from resources, whether it was groceries, healthcare, all of it in this little concentrated area. So when we talk about, where we see pockets of violence in our city, when you do the heat map and look at where the highest rates of unemployment, where you look at, educational attainment, it was emblematic of Cabrini. And then we were on valued land, gentrification takes over, folks are scattered about. We move folks who have been choked off in these concentrations of poverty, we fling them across the city without resources, without a support network, and we watch those pockets of violence pick up in other places. And then the land that was once Cabrini houses not just opportunity, but like excess, where there are now places where it wasn't good enough to put a grocery store for poor people of color, we have indoor skydiving. And so it says a lot about our values and our priorities, and when we talk about the legitimacy of systems and how people who are engaged in the criminal justice system, largely poor, largely people of color, and the ability to ascend from those beginnings are really difficult. So when you talk about an us and them in the criminal justice system, I am a them who was fortunate to get beyond that. Cabrini was a short hop, skip, and a jump away from Lincoln Park and from Old Town and from opportunity. And it was because we moved, because I got to go to a magnet school, that I think I sit here today. So that all gives me the context of how I look at our criminal justice system, how I look at the people who come through it, that I see in each of the families, whether they are victims or defendants, a space where that I could either sit on either side of the aisle with them, having had family members who have been involved in the criminal justice system and myself having been a victim, and looking at their demographics and know that I share the exact same. There's an obligation that I have to be disruptive to the criminal justice system.
So, but this is not in the Law and Order script. So
it's not.
So
you rarely see the person in the big office on Law and Order where they go back and ask, can we do this? They don't look like me. And so it's not in the script. You have, most elected prosecutors in this country, it's about 2,400 of them. Less than 1% are women of color, less than 1%. Our criminal justice system here in Cook County, 86% of the people who come in are African American and Latino. My office right now, we have about 9% of people of color as prosecutors. And so no, there's kind of an obvious sea change when you see people of color in positions like this in a criminal justice system that is primarily made of people who look like me.
So, thank you, I appreciate that. Julie, I want to bring you in on this. There's a thread that Kim was talking about, this question of legitimacy and the changes in the city and sort of the us and the them, and this lack of trust that has existed, the way that people look at the criminal justice system. It's not just a Chicago thing, though. It's also a national thing. You see it all over the country. So what's at stake if we don't attend to this? And what are you working on at MacArthur to get at this problem?
So I think, first of all, we have to remember that Kim is up against an enormous moment in our history where it isn't just the criminal justice system whose legitimacy is in question. It is major institutions of all types. When you think about people's skepticism about the media and the news, when you think about the question about whether a fact is a fact or a fact is a feeling, or whether there is, how do people feel about the Catholic Church? How do people feel about institutions of all types? So we're in the middle of a moment where people are questioning institutions that are important in people's lives, and some of them which actually are an essential component of the underpinning of our democracy. And that's where I think the legitimacy or the lack of legitimacy of the criminal justice system has to be considered, not just on its own, which is how do people feel about the experience that they have when they encounter it? Is it biased? Is it unjust? Is it harmful? That in and of itself is extremely bad. But when you think about the encounter that individuals have with the criminal justice system, starting from the very moment of initial contact with arrest, whether appropriate, just, or not, all the way through, when people do see the system as illegitimate, I don't think they can say that system is illegitimate, but let me function as an active citizen in contact with all other systems. So I think that if we don't start to get the criminal justice system right, I think we have a deep erosion that continues unabated with respect to almost all of our systems. So I think those of us who are working in this system have an extraordinary responsibility to try to rebuild. Well, I don't know if it's rebuild, it's build.
I want to come back to that in a second, but I'd love to draw you into this conversation, Arnie. So you've, as we all know, you've dedicated the bulk of your career to education, but in coming back to Chicago, you've really focused on job creation and private sector engagement, jobs for young people, as opposed to education. So that's surprising to me. So why did you do that?
Well, to be clear, I'm focusing on that as a means to an end. So what I'm really focused on is the violence in the city. And violence is not a new issue in Chicago. It's something we dealt with growing up. I lost friends when I was a teenager to violence, and that shapes you and scars you in some pretty tough ways. When I ran the Chicago public schools for 7.5 years, during those 7.5 years, on average, we lost a child every 2 weeks due to gun violence. And everything else, academic achievement, budgets, labor management, all those other issues were easy compared to the violence issue. And going to those funerals, going to classrooms where there's an empty desk, going to those homes was by far the hardest thing that I did. And very, very totally naively in hindsight, when my family and I left to go to DC now 8 years ago, I thought we were at rock bottom. I thought we couldn't get worse. In the 7 years we were gone, we got a hell of a lot worse. And coming back and just I just wanted to help. Like, so many people helped me growing up, so many people gave me opportunities. This was the crisis that the city's facing. The fact that we have more murders than New York and LA combined is mind-boggling. Collectively, we are all failing. There's no easy way to put it. There's no other way to sugarcoat it. And so for me, the goal is not to lock up a lot more folks. I think mass incarceration has been a disaster in the minority community, particularly in the Black community here in Chicago. And we're just simply trying to give young men who are at risk of shooting and being shot, and that's one and the same, that is the same profile. We're just trying to give them a chance to make some money in the legal economy. And in every crisis, there's an opportunity. It is so violent out there. It is so tough. Many guys are looking to get out. And there's a myth they're all making a lot of money on the street selling drugs. They're making less than minimum wage in many cases and getting shot at, and the police are chasing them. So we're hiring young men. We're still very small. We're making mistakes every single day. We're in Rosen Pullman and hiring them, and they're working, doing neighborhood beautification and doing some rehabbing some homes and working through social and emotional issues. Many have lived with trauma all their life and working through that. And we've been at it for 5 months and just amazingly proud of what our guys are doing every single day. Don't ever want to jinx us, but to date, none of our guys have been shot. None of them, to the best of our knowledge, are shooting anybody. Many had been shot, and 2 of them were shooting at each other before we started the program in the fall. And they've come a long, long way. A couple have been hired now in the mainstream economy just in the past week, which is fantastic to see. And we're just really starting to think about scale now. Can we get to a lot more guys? And there's a small percent that Kim needs to deal with, but we want to, I think that's the minority. I'm convinced that's the minority. The majority would love to be able to do everything that we do. They want to eat, they want to provide for their children, they want to have a roof over their head. They would love to do that in the legal economy. We're just trying to give them a chance to make a different, rational choice.
So You work for you're a managing partner for the Emerson Collective. For people who don't know, the Emerson Collective was created by Lorene Jobs, Steve Jobs' widow. And I'm fascinated by Chicago Cred, so I have a double question for you. One is, tell us what Chicago Cred, the program, what Cred stands for. But also, it sounds so common sense. So that you're working as part of the Emerson Collective, which I think of Silicon Valley, I think of killer apps, that there has to be this, new thing. But it also, it speaks to sort of a common sense thing that we should have been doing for a long time. Do you feel like it's new? Is there something different about it?
It is different in that we're trying to say these men have tremendous value. They are tremendous leaders. They are extraordinarily resilient. They have survived things that are unimaginable to me, and they have a lot to offer society. And rather than continuing to marginalize them and disenfranchise them and give them no chance to be men in the legal economy, we're just trying to open that door. And it is hard work. The epiphany for me is, I'm a slow learner, is that really coming to understand that if we want to reduce shootings in Chicago, we actually have to work with people who are doing the shooting. And all my life, as you said, I've worked on the prevention side, and I want to keep working on the prevention side, but we have to work with the folks who are shooting and being shot. And I meet with brilliant people all day, every day, but I spend a decent amount of time in Cook County Jail talking to the guys there. And it's honestly, no disrespect to all the smart people I talk to, that's where I do my best learning. And every time I just test, here's the grand bargain. We want to hire you, but you got to stop doing what you're doing. You got to stop shooting. What's that price point? Everyone's got a price to change behavior. And it's dozens and dozens of time. It's $12, $13 an hour. It's peanuts. And we lock these guys up at $55,000, $60,000 in Cook County and do that quite happily. That's all of our taxpayer dollars. But we refuse to hire these guys at $25,000, $28,000, $30,000 a year. There's a term I used to use, I've stopped, called disconnected youth. We all talk about disconnected youth. We have a small team, we got 8 people on our team. None of us are from the South Side, none of us from Rose and Pullman. We found these guys in 6 days. They weren't hard to find. They're looking to change. It wasn't that they were disconnected from us, we were disconnected from them.
Thank you. Kim, I want to come back to a theme that Julie raised, and it has to do with the role of facts. And one of the things that I know that you're doing is that you've made I think it's called a transparency pledge, which is a fascinating thing for a prosecutor's office. That's rare. So could you say a little bit about that and why that's an unusual thing?
Certainly. We, as prosecutors, we consider ourselves the gatekeepers of the criminal justice system. And so we have a tremendous amount of power to decide who we charge, what we charge, who gets diverted. And yet we are the most opaque of the players in the criminal justice system. And so when people say the system is not fair, how do we know that you are treating people from, Roseland Pullman the same that you're treating people from Ravenswood? We've never had the opportunity to say that we weren't. To not be transparent with how we do our work, again, goes to the legitimacy point. In the absence of facts, in the absence of proof, people will fill in the narrative. And the sad reality is that we know what the data will likely say, but we have to just put it out there, lay the benchmark out there, because we can't fix what we can't measure. And so we've pledged, early on, it was a hallmark of my transition team, and my transition was, how do we responsibly gather the information and share it so that from a public-facing standpoint, the people that we serve, we're public servants, know where our benchmark is. How do you hold me accountable? You talk about how some of these laws have come on the books around mass incarceration. It's been this tough on crime approach, but we never really quite figured out what that looked like. How am I valued as a prosecutor in keeping us safer? How am I valued in having the legitimacy of a system if you don't know how I do my job? And then internally, how do we explain to my prosecutors what justice looks like? How do they know that they're not making decisions based on some level of implicit bias? How do we know that we're not doing the proper training without the data? And so that transparency goes both ways to the public, so they know how we do our work, and internally so that we can set the right value system and work towards that system with transparency.
Do people know what to expect? I mean, if, to use the law and order, motif for a second, if that's what people expect of prosecutors, and you show this data, how do you, do they know, oh, that's good, we're happy to see you doing that?
I think the public does.
Yeah.
I mean, I think some of the good work that obviously Vera has been doing in the space of working with prosecutors around being transparent with the data, I think there's now this growing expectation. You ask yourself, at a time when Chicago is seeing an increased level of violence, where the President of the United States continues to call out Chicago on a regular basis, you would think that it would not resonate with folks at the same time when you talk about reform and transparency and legitimacy, that the same neighborhoods that have been ravaged by violence the most are the ones who are screaming the most to hear from us that we're doing our jobs fairly. They are not saying, you've got to hit everybody over the head. They want their communities to be safe. They want you to treat them fairly. They aren't saying that they don't want police in their communities. They want fair policing. And so I think the response that we've gotten, running a campaign on criminal justice reform from a prosecutor standpoint in a city like Chicago in the year and a half that we've seen, I think speaks to the readiness of the community to be a partner and to put the community at the center. I think all of this, when we talk about transparency, when we talk about legitimacy, it's having the community at the center of that conversation and saying, how do we serve you? As opposed to, this is what we do and you just react to how we do it. And I think there's a real receptiveness to that. I think people don't know how to make of it, what to make of it, but I think there's a consensus that what we've been doing in Chicago and Cook County as a country for so long isn't working. And that the value proposition of our criminal justice system has not given the return that people have expected, and they are willing to do something different right now.
So, Julia, is Kim an aberration? I mean, you should talk a little bit about the Safety and Justice Challenge and the work that you're doing nationally. The things that Kim is talking about, the sort of changes in expectations for what law enforcement might do, the notion of what we've heard about today about incarceration should not be the only answer. This thirst for building trust and greater engagement. Is it just a Chicago thing, or do you see it elsewhere? And why is that even important? Why should we be thinking?
So in the spirit of answering a different question, I thought that...
Touché.
No, I'll get to that because it's a really important question. But I think, first of all, we should put the conversation about mass incarceration at the local level in the context of the larger theme of the event here, which is reimagining prison. And I think that we have to remember that prison is just sort of like the umbrella phrase for the entire criminal justice system that doesn't start when you're convicted to go into a state or federal prison. It starts when you are someone who encounters a policeman on the corner in your neighborhood. And then you are inexorably drawn into a system which ultimately puts you in the jail, which you're talking about. And the jail is actually a gateway force multiplier for the prison system. So when you think about the 2 million to 2.3 million people that are in the state and federal system, you have to add to that the 11 million admissions there are each year into jails across the country. So I think we have to be very careful not to only talk about one component of mass incarceration. So, but to bring it back to, is Kim an aberration? Kim, I think, is emblematic of a new generation of political will and compassion and desire to actually say the status quo does not stand. And so that's what I think. But I am also encouraged by the sites around the country that are participating in a MacArthur Foundation criminal justice reform initiative, which is focused on trying to really turn around the misuse and the overuse of jails. Because once someone is in jail, and then they are there for a while, and they may not even be convicted, so they are there in the presumed innocent phase of the contact with the system. And research shows that the longer you're in a jail, it increases the likelihood of committing a crime, getting a longer sentence, and then ending up in prison itself. But what we're seeing, and I was fearful in the context of the last election, that there may be a decline in political will in these sites around the country to acknowledge that their local criminal justice systems have failed, as Arnie says, have failed, and that actually the combination of the players in the local system, the prosecutor, the sheriff, the chief executive, the courts, there is a sense that it cannot continue in many places around the country. So the places where I have the most optimism are the ones where people in the system look beyond their each individual set of incentives that guide what they do. And they say, no, we have to come together across that and really grapple with this issue that we have, which is structural racism, which is inattention to the potential for people. And it's, even if we can divert people from the system, do we have the political will to put the resources behind the substance abuse or the mental illness support? So it's a very complex sort of set of issues, but I think it's a moment, even in the context of mass incarceration, where there is political will around the country to actually do something about it.
It's neat to have you both on this stage, and that you referenced the research, I mean, what we know about the impact of jail and how that is in fact buttressing this initiative that you have. So MacArthur is also very well known for the support that you provided to expand our understanding of the adolescent brain and the sort of impulsivity that I think we all recognize when we see young people and young adults, but also the potential for change. And that's had a really dramatic impact on the juvenile justice system and is now helping us to think differently about young adults. And so I want to turn this question to you, Arnie, which is, that's the research on the adolescent brain. You're, up until you're 24, so you're more prone to impulsivity and engage in risky behavior, yet there's an opportunity for change. Do you see that in the young people that you're working with?
Well, I think all of us were adolescents, not too long ago, and is that a piece of it?
Pretty long ago.
Pretty long ago. two or 3 years ago. And so that research is valid and important, but I just want to be clear that for me that's a bailout, that's an excuse. And if we didn't have the huge prevalence of guns, if we had positive things for these kids to do, I always ask them to tell me their stories, and they've made choices because there was no other choice. It's actually not some lack of impulse control. They often at age 12 or 13 become the men of their homes. Mom's on crack or an alcoholic, dad's locked up, incarcerated, or gone, and they have to provide for themselves and for their sisters and brothers. And there is one person hiring, and that's the guy in the corner. And they make a very non-impulsive, very rational choice to talk to the one person who can help them eat and wear some clothes. The youngest guy said he started selling drugs at 9 years old. He said, Arnie, it was pretty hard to sell drugs at 9 years old. And I said, I bet it was. That's not impulse control, that's not whatever. That's a desperate move. And all the rest of us in rooms like this were absent from his life and from his community. And so we should understand that research, but that for me is not the cure to what's driving this. If I can just make 2 or 3 other quick points. And this is, I spoke at breakfast yesterday, at lunch yesterday, at dinner, and this is my fourth thing in 2 days. And they've all been downtown. I think it's just really important that downtown is a very, very comfortable place to be. This is not a citywide problem. This is a neighborhood-based problem. I think we need to start having forums like this in North Lawndale and in Englewood and in Austin. And the forums like this I think are helpful. It's good to share ideas, but it was in a high school, a fantastic high school, North Lawndale College Prep 2 weeks ago. In that high school, one high school, 2.5, 3 miles from here, they've had 14 kids shot since August. One high school. That's their reality. And none of our reality is going home every single night. And until we start to, yesterday in Chicago, 7 people were killed. None of them downtown, none of them where any of us live. But until we really start to understand and walk and experience as best we can what these young folks are dealing with, we're going to continue to play around the margins. I just would challenge all of us to act with just an extraordinary sense of urgency, because it's not fair and it's not right. And the level of fear and the level of grief and anger, it's overwhelming. It's overwhelming, and that's every day. That's what they're living with every day. To sort of go to the theme, Reimagine Prisons, last thing I'll say is gave a speech 2 years ago at the National Press Club in DC, and shocked that people didn't take my idea and run with it, but I got to keep pushing it. But if we took, prisons cost a lot of money. They're not cheap. And we figured out if you took half of the nonviolent offenders out of prisons nationally, that would save you $15 billion a year, 15 billion with a B. You could take that 15 billion and give every teacher in a high poverty school in the Cabrini Greens of the world a 50% pay increase. So just think about, easier said than done, but no new tax dollars, not another nickel. But I'd much rather pay great teachers to go work in Englewood and North Lawndale and Austin than I would lock people up at the back end. We could, if we had the courage as a nation, we could make that trade tomorrow.
I think this is a perfect place to stop, and I want to say, I'm sure that the 4 of us all have as a hero Bryan Stevenson. And one of the things that he says that I think was just beautifully echoed in what you said, Arnie, is that the only way we will make change in this country is that we have to get proximate, that there's research and there's data and there are public servants who will do different things, but each and every one of us has to understand the human beings who are affected by this system that we have and break it down, get into the neighborhoods that you're talking about, or break it down to the choices that a 9-year-old kid had, which were none because we failed to make those choices available. And we're talking about a massive system, but what a great place to end it, thinking about the human beings who are impacted by it and their families. So thank you for that. Thank you to all of you for coming tonight.